Upon our last encounter with Captain Benteen and his three companies, he had completed his reconnaissance and was rejoining the main trail along Reno Creek, while the pack train was situated approximately a mile to the east. After proceeding down the creek for about a quarter to half a mile, he halted at a location known as the morass to allow the men to rest and the horses to drink. This moment introduces our first point of contention, as critics of Benteen argue that he, to put it bluntly, wasted time at the morass. Estimates suggest that Benteen's command remained at the morass for approximately 15 to 20 minutes. I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments regarding Benteen's actions during this period. Growing increasingly impatient with the duration of the stop, Captain Weir, who was in command of D Company and had led the advance, suggested to Lieutenant Godfrey of K Company that they should approach Benteen and urge him to resume their march. However, Godfrey was reluctant to confront Benteen and chose to remain inactive, prompting Weir to proceed down the trail independently. Observing this, Benteen promptly ordered the remainder of the command to follow and took his position at the front of the column. A mile to the west, Benteen paused to quickly assess a burning teepee before continuing onward. As the command advanced downstream, they began to hear the sounds of gunfire. Shortly thereafter, Daniel Knipe, with or without an official message from Tom Custer, rode past, conveying that they were needed at the front as swiftly as possible. Further along, Private John Martin arrived, delivering Custer's final message to Benteen. Martin presented the note to his company commanders, who remained silent. Benteen then inquired about General Custer's whereabouts, to which Martin responded that Custer was approximately 3 miles ahead, and added that Major Reno was charging the camp. Benteen concluded that the tasks of moving quickly and bringing the packs were mutually exclusive, leading him to believe he could only pursue one objective at a time. Upon reaching his conclusion, he declared, "If I am to assist him, it would be prudent not to wait for the packs." Consequently, he dispatched Martin back to the pack train to inform Captain McDougal to expedite the delivery of the packs. He then proceeded downstream at a brisk pace until he arrived at the location where Reno and Custer had previously separated, exclaiming, "Here we find ourselves at a crossroads." Following a brief conversation among Benteen and the company leaders, they resolved to advance to the left towards the river, while the remainder of the command moved to the right. As they continued their ride, they observed combat occurring in the valley and figures on the bluffs ahead. But who were they? Custer, Reno, the Native Americans? These observations prompted the command to spur their horses forward, with Benteen leading the way, until he encountered a visibly distressed Major Marcus Reno. "For heaven's sake, Benteen, stop your command and assist me," Reno cried out. "I have lost half my men. We are defeated." Benteen presented Reno with Cook's note, but Reno was unaware of Custer's whereabouts. At this juncture, Benteen was believed to have suggested to Reno that they should unite with Custer as swiftly as possible. Nevertheless, Reno insisted on waiting for the pack train, as his men required additional ammunition. Thus, Reno, the senior officer in that area, effectively halted any immediate efforts to provide support to Custer. Benteen, now subordinate to Reno, adhered to the responsibilities of an officer in a defensive scenario and ordered Weir and Godfrey to establish skirmish lines. As the few remaining survivors of Reno's force reached the bluffs, the troops observed the majority of the warriors moving downstream, while other villagers stayed behind to kill and mutilate those who could not escape during the retreat. Soon gunfire, possibly in volleys, echoed from downstream. Lieutenant Varnum turned to Lieutenant Wallace and exclaimed, "My goodness, did you hear that?" Even the partially deaf Lieutenant Godfrey noted the sound of intense firing. The 6 companies, despite the fact that 3 of them were significantly weakened, did not respond to the call of battle. The situation deteriorated further. Initially, Reno failed to make any systematic attempt to establish a thorough defense or to conduct reconnaissance that would clarify the circumstances. He then committed a grave error. Rather than securing effective control, he descended the bluffs with approximately a dozen troopers to locate the body of his aide, Lieutenant Hodgson. This endeavor took about 30 minutes, during which Reno found the body, retrieved some personal items, and returned to a command that had remained inactive throughout his absence. Upon his return, Reno appointed Lieutenant Hare as his adjutant and instructed him to expedite the movement of the packs. Meanwhile, on the skirmish line, Captain Weir was becoming increasingly anxious. As the heavy gunfire from downstream began to wane, Weir turned to his subordinates, Lieutenant Edgerly and First Sergeant Michael Martin, originally from Dublin, Ireland, and inquired if they would be willing to advance even if the other companies did not. Both agreed, prompting Weir to approach the recently arrived Reno for a discussion. Following a brief disagreement, compounded by the mutual animosity between Reno and Weir, Weir set off alone to the north along the bluffs. Edgerly, believing Weir had received permission to advance, mounted D Company and followed him. Upon reaching the summit that now bears his name, Captain Weir deployed D Company in a skirmish line. Gazing into the distance, Weir remarked, "That is Custer over there." One of his sergeants, the Irish-born Civil War veteran James Flanagan, responded, "Here, Captain, you should take a look through the glasses. I believe those are Indians." Observing D Company's movement, Captain Benteen assumed there was an order to advance. He has companies H, K, and M mobilizing and advancing northward as well. At this juncture, Captain McDougall arrives alongside Lieutenant Matthey and the pack train, establishing a new skirmish line, an action that Reno should have recognized as necessary and addressed. With the arrival of the pack train, Reno finally takes action. He first sends Lieutenant Hare with a message to Weir to initiate communication with Custer. Next, he orders a trumpeter to sound the halt. However, Benteen disregards this and proceeds to Weir Point, where he organizes his forces. Noticing Benteen's lack of response, Reno commands the remaining soldiers, packs, and the wounded to move out. Those who were unable to walk were carried in a blanket by a detail of 6 soldiers. From Weir Point, it became evident to the defenders that numerous warriors were advancing toward them. Displeased with the defensive position, Benteen returns to Reno and persuades him to reverse course and return to the position they had just abandoned. With Benteen hastily heading south and, for reasons unknown, Weir also riding back to join Reno and Benteen, the two companies under French and Edgerly were left vulnerable and without directives. Soon the anxious troopers of companies D and M began to engage in skirmishes with the warriors. Recognizing the escalating situation, McDougall approached Benteen and inquired, "What will be the outcome of this unless we have a commanding officer here very soon? You are the senior captain, and we would appreciate your leadership in this matter." Benteen merely smiled, but from that moment on, he largely assumed command of the final defense. Although he made a few errors, one could argue that he ultimately saved the remainder of the 7th Cavalry from destruction later that day and the following day. Realizing they had been abandoned, French and Edgerly mounted their horses and retreated southward, pursued closely by the warriors. One soldier, Vincent Charlie, who was born in Switzerland, was shot from his horse and subsequently abandoned by his command. He met a grim fate as a wooden stick or a broken guidance shaft was thrust down his throat. It was now Lieutenant Godfrey's turn to lead a valiant rearguard action while commanding Company K. He had previously achieved notable success at the Wichita and had effectively led his men during the Yellowstone campaign, despite being perceived by some as indolent and lacking military demeanor. As he observed the two companies retreating in disarray, Godfrey took charge by directing Lieutenant Hare, dismounting his men, and sending the No. 4S with the horses back to the main command. The company, organized into 2 platoons and comprising approximately 30 men, alternated between firing and moving back. Under intense pressure and gunfire from the opposing warriors, the soldiers began to cluster together, and it was only through the threats issued by Lieutenant Hare and Godfrey that order was maintained. With no casualties reported, the command ultimately dashed the final 100 yards into the relative safety of the 7th defensive perimeter. Their courage and leadership provided the remaining command with the opportunity to regroup. Lieutenant Hare, who had earlier referred to himself as a fighting son of a bitch from Texas, indeed lived up to that description. Upon visiting the Reno-Benteen defensive site, it becomes evident that the location is far from ideal for defense. Lacking natural cover, the troopers and civilians resorted to using saddles, deceased animals, grain bags, and any available materials to create some form of protection. It is noteworthy that there were only 3 spades available within the entire command. By the time night fell on June 25th, 12 troopers had been killed and an additional 21 wounded. Throughout the night, all companies, with the exception of Benteen's H Company, took steps to enhance their positions, and even constructed some rifle pits. In the valley, the Sioux and Cheyenne rejoiced in their victory until dawn, when the battle recommenced. By late afternoon on the 26th, the fighting concluded, and the natives ignited the grass along the river, a common strategy to conceal their movements. As the day progressed, the soldiers observed in astonishment as the villages advanced upstream along the Little Bighorn. That evening, the command tended to their animals and reunited with some of their fellow soldiers, including Lieutenant DeRudio, who had been concealed in the timber since the ill-fated Reno's charge. A few administrative announcements are in order. First, welcome to Antietam. Behind me is Burnside's Bridge, and we are approaching the final 2 or 3 episodes of the Sioux War. As a preview, we will revisit George Crook, who commanded a brigade here in an attempt to seize the bridge. Brigadier General Samuel Sturgis was also present, and we will return to discuss Sturgis in those concluding episodes. Additionally, we will examine a controversial commander. Allow me to refer to my notes for a moment. This particular officer, who was highly decorated during the Civil War, had a public disagreement with the U.S. president. Another president, Theodore Roosevelt, referred to him as a brave peacock, a phrase that was certainly not complimentary. His critics labeled him as vain, pompous, and possessing unappealing personality traits that led to widespread disdain among a significant portion of the officer corps. I am, of course, referring to Nelson Miles, as you likely anticipated. On the afternoon of June 24th, Generals Terry and Gibbon crossed the Yellowstone River. Their forces included 4 cavalry and 5 infantry companies, a detachment of Gatling guns, and the remaining Crow Scouts. The following day, the column proceeded southward, guided by an individual unfamiliar with the terrain, resulting in a sluggish pace. Just before midnight on the 26th, the command came to a halt a mile and a half north of the junction of the Bighorn and Little Bighorn rivers, which was their intended destination for the day. The next morning on the 27th, the command encountered 3 of Custer's Crow Scouts. White Man Runs Him, Harry Moccasin, and another who ventured ahead. They reported that the majority of Custer's forces had been decimated, leaving only a small contingent. Upon receiving this information, General Terry expressed disbelief, stating, "I find it impossible to believe that such a distinguished regiment as the 7th Cavalry could have suffered such a disaster." As the soldiers continued their advance, they discovered several abandoned teepees containing the bodies of fallen warriors. Further exploration of the area revealed the severed heads of 3 white soldiers, Lieutenant Sturgis's undergarments, Captain Yates's gloves, and Lieutenant Porter's buckskin jacket. Lieutenant Bradley and his scouts, positioned on the eastern bank of the river, were the first to uncover the bodies and relay the information to Terry. When Terry met with the survivors of the 7th and informed them of the fate of the rest of the command, Benteen expressed his skepticism. "I can hardly believe it. I suspect he is somewhere down the Bighorn tending to his horses. He abandoned part of his command during the Battle of the Ouachita, and I believe he would do so again." Terry, displeased with this remark, responded firmly, "I think you are mistaken. You will take your company and proceed to the location where the dead are lying to investigate for yourself." Upon reaching Last Stand Hill, a trooper gestured for Benteen to approach and view what was believed to be George Custer's body. Benteen dismounted, approached the corpse, and exclaimed, "By God, that is him," before remounting and riding away.